Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. So it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Gabriel Foley. Gabriel hails from Saskatchewan, Canada, and at the University of Regina, he researched nighthawk habitat use in Canada's boreal forest. Then went on to study white-browed Sparrow-Weaver nest building at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Before coming to Maryland, he worked on research projects in Alaska, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nunavut. Now we're really fortunate to have him as the state coordinator of the Maryland, DC Breeding Bird Atlas. For the past 3 years, I've been working with Gabriel on the Atlas. I've really come to admire the energy and intelligence and innovative use of technology and media in this research project. So please join me in welcoming Gabriel Foley. I'm just gonna give you the right to share here. Okay, you should be able to share, Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate that. Okay, let me get this sharing set up. Always takes a second. Let's share that. Okay, you can see that? That looks like slides to you?
Yep, looks
All right,
good.
excellent. Okay, I am, as always, really excited to talk about my favorite project, the Breeding Bird Atlas. I'm going to talk about kind of two main things. The first is just giving you kind of a picture of effort in the last couple of years for the project. And then I'm going to talk about the breeding code review system that we've set up and kind of explain how that works. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to interrupt me. I've given an Atlas talk to the Montgomery Bird Club a few times now, and if you've been to one, you've probably seen this slide, but I always like to introduce the project for folks who aren't familiar with it. So the Breeding Bird Atlas is a statewide project. It also includes DC, and it's mapping breeding birds across the region. To do that, it uses this grid that you see up in the top right. There's about 1,300 of these squares that are overlaid across the whole region, and they're about 3 miles by 3 miles. And observers go into every single one of those blocks, and they try to document as many species breeding there as they can find. This project has been done twice in the past, so this is the third time that we're doing it. It was done once in the 80s, once in the early 2000s, and now it started in 2020. So we're coming into year 4. This is a 5-year project, so it blows my mind, but we are getting towards the end of the project. And because of that, you're going to hear me giving you a few guidelines about how we can most maximize the field season this year towards kind of having a successful statewide project. So the idea behind this project, a mapping project, is to provide breeding species maps for everything that nests within Maryland and DC. We want to show where across Maryland and DC you can find them, how many there are, and when it is that they're nesting. These data can then be used to document population changes in Maryland and DC. And in fact, other than the state of New York, this is actually the first time that anyone in North America has done a third breeding bird atlas. Other people have done 2 before, but we're kind of on the groundbreaking side of things, which is exciting. So we can really demonstrate some of these population change as well. We can show where important areas are for birds, excuse me, whether that's for just, a single species or a group of species. And we can identify species that might be at risk. In fact, the State Wildlife Action Plan is coming up for revision soon, and the breeding bird atlas data will be perfectly positioned to be informing some of those updates. So our focus is on breeding birds, but how do you know that a bird is actually breeding and not just, a bird hanging out there? So the main way that we do it is we look for bird behavior that is linked to breeding. And just like Scott was telling us about, with these distraction displays, there are some things like distraction displays that are really good evidence of a bird that's breeding there. And there's other things that are just okay evidence. But we record all of it and classify it using a set of about 22 different breeding codes. These are all represented on the data sheets by 1 or 2 letter codes. Down here, I've got examples for like H for a bird that's in the right habitat, P for, pair of birds, or NE for a nest with eggs, things like that. Now, some of those are really good evidence. Others are less so. A bird that's just in the right habitat is not the greatest indication that it's actually nesting there. So we break all of those codes up into 3 different statuses. A bird that's just in the right habitat would be a possible breeder. Something like a pair of birds would be a probable breeder. And if you find a nest with eggs or you see a distraction display, that is a confirmed nesting bird. Along with the behavior that you find, you're also going to record the location and the date. And to do that, we use eBird. If you do very much birding, sooner or later, you're going to come across eBird. It's become very popular for birders. It's a great way to record where and when you've been birding and what you've seen. There's an app, which I think most folks use now. I think about 80% of checklists are actually submitted on the app now. And you can also go to the website. There's a little bit more that you can explore on the website. And for our particular project, the Maryland and DC Breeding Bird Atlas, there's something called a portal. And that portal is, if you want to participate in the project, what you would use to submit your checklists. And all that it does is really apply a label to your checklist that say, hey, I was participating in the Breeding Bird Atlas, and I was, following all of the recommended guidelines when I was doing that. So some of the other great things that the eBird system does for us that makes it perfect for this is provides space for those breeding codes on a checklist, allows you to put in abundance for how many birds you've seen. If you're using the app, it automatically records your location and how long and how far you were atlasing for, and it lets you upload photos or recordings or comments with your observations. And then you can go to the website and you can see everybody else's contributions. It's perfect for this sort of project and a really exciting thing to kind of dive into and explore. So then the next thing that I'm kind of going to talk about is effort. This is, of course, a map of Maryland and DC and all of the counties in the region. And the numbers that are laid on the map are the number of hours that folks have spent atlasing in that particular county. And it's all color coded as well. So the brighter the blue, the more hours of atlasing that have been spent on the project. And atlasing effort here is, these are eBird checklists that were either nocturnal or that had a breeding code somewhere on the checklist. And of course, they had to be submitted to the portal. Now, what you can see here is that Montgomery County is doing great. Montgomery County has been working hard. There's obviously more hours in the county than anywhere else. One of the other things that you can see is that for the most part, a lot of the effort is concentrated in Montgomery County, Baltimore County, and Howard County, this stretch here right in the middle. Now, while we're talking about this effort on the map, that's everything that's gone into the atlas so far, just shy of 100,000 hours total for the project. Down here in the bottom left is a line graph that shows the annual effort. So the effort every year of the project divided across each week of the year. So on the bottom of the graph is the week, and on the left-hand side is the number of hours. And the main reason why I wanted to show this is kind of to show how effort has changed across years. You can see in 2020, we had a big spike, and I kind of attribute that to both the novelty of the project. Everybody wanted to be involved. Everybody was coding everything that they saw. Plus, you know, we had the lockdown start in 2020, and so some folks had, you know, more time available to be out atlasing. 2021 and 2022 have been pretty stable relative to each other. So this is a GIF of that annual effort mapped out onto each of the different counties. Goes from 2020 all the way to 2022. And the main thing to notice here is that the distribution of effort across all the counties doesn't really change. You don't, even though it's cycling through each year, the colors don't really change between counties. So the main thing that I'm drawing attention to with this is that Montgomery, Baltimore, and Howard County are doing really, really well. But we've got to try and spread some of that effort out over the next couple of years. Here's another way to look at it. Each county is labeled on this graph. On the left-hand side, you have the number of hours that have been spent atlasing in that county. You know, Montgomery is up here at 16,000 hours. Down here on the bottom, you have the number of atlasers who spent the most time atlasing in that county. So presumably they live there. And what you see is exactly what you would expect. It's distributed by population size of the county. Montgomery, Baltimore, Howard County, these are the most populated counties. You've got another cluster here at around 4,000 hours. And then down in the bottom left, we have another bunch, and we can confirm that by looking at the population size of each county. And yes, what we see is that the top 8 counties, population-wise, everything over 250,000 residents, are all of the counties that are above 4,000 hours of effort for the Atlas project. So population size really does make a difference. Now there is one exception here, and that's Garrett County. You'll see on the population figure, Garrett County is way down on the right. And this is largely just due to Garrett being a pretty major destination for birders during the breeding season. It has a lot of species that are hard to find elsewhere in the state. So the main takeaway here that I'm emphasizing is that the population centers of Maryland is where a lot of the atlasing effort has gone into. And so we have 2 field seasons left. We really have to try and kind of smooth that out a little bit more than what we have right now. Here is another way to kind of look at it, but from a species perspective. Okay, so this is just a histogram. On the bottom of the graph, on the x-axis, you have the number of species that are in each. Each of these bars represents that number of species. And these are all number of species that were added to a block. So if you think about at the start of the atlas, all the blocks were at 0. You go into a block in 2020, you can add 50 species, no problem, to a block, right? And the different colors represent the different years. Green is 2020, purple is 2022. You can see that, well, the rate of accumulating species has really slowed down in the past year. And so you might think, well, we've pretty much got everything filled in. But then if we look at it in a slightly different way, if we still look at the number of coded species in a block, but we just look at the total number for each block, right? So how many species does a block have right now? You can see that, well, most of them are over 50 species, but there's a very substantial proportion of blocks that have 50, and even quite a few, that have less than 50, and even quite a few that have less than 25. Now, a lot of these very small blocks or very low species count blocks are also very small in area. This may not change very much at all because, they're blocks that are bordered by the Potomac, or they're blocks that are cut off by the Pennsylvania border or something like that. But the main takeaway from this is that there is still atlasing to be done in blocks that are, a little bit further away. So then I wanted to kind of think about, okay, well, how does effort play into actually coding any particular species? And so I looked at the average effort that it took to first code a species. And I was actually really surprised at how long the average was, even for something very common, like Carolina wren. The average effort it took to code that species was over 3 hours, which to me, I was expecting much less. And I think that one of the main reasons for this is that, of course, when I'm looking at effort here, I'm only using atlasing effort. And so some species come into safe dates early, right? Like house sparrow, you can start coding them within the guidelines of the atlas next month. And if you're like me, you code every house sparrow that you see. And so all of a sudden those checklists become atlasing checklists. And so that kind of increases the average for a lot of these other species. So I looked at then also the mean effort to detect a species rather than just to code it. And the scales aren't quite the same here. This goes out well beyond 750 hours. This other one only goes to 400 hours. But the takeaway on this is that the detection rather than the coding is a little bit less than the coding. Now, there's two other things that will influence that. And one is the bird's behavior. Of course, it actually does take more work to code a species, especially if you don't just use, well, the bird was in the right habitat. If you, want to put in a little bit of extra effort to find something, some higher tier evidence, well, that takes more time. So that influences things. And then there's also observer behavior. How likely are you to actually code a species when you see it? If maybe you're somebody who only likes to code nests that you find, there's nothing wrong with that. Perfectly acceptable way to do things. But of course, that's going to then change when you're looking at, the big, just statewide rough picture. So then one other way to look at the same information on the x-axis here on the bottom, this is exactly the same as what we were just looking at on that previous figure. This is the average effort that it takes to code a species. But instead of just, how many species fit into that average, it is how many blocks have that species coded. So there's 206 dots on here because there's 206 species that have a breeding code in the atlas right now. And what you would kind of expect to see is that the easier or the faster it is to code a species, you would think that you would have them in more blocks, assuming, of course, that they're well distributed across the region. And that is basically what you see here. But I was surprised. There's a slight trend here where as it becomes, a little bit, it takes longer to code a species. You find them in fewer blocks, but it's not quite the trend that I was expecting. It's a little bit more vertical. If you zoom in on it, this is the same figure, but the X limit is just cut off here at 100 hours instead of the other one went to 400. You can see it a little bit more clearly, but it's still, I was surprised at this. So then that leads into the topic of block targets. So to be able to compare all of these different blocks, right? We have 1,300 of them, and we want to be able to map species across the region accurately and precisely. We need to have a minimum threshold for each block that shows that it's been sampled thoroughly. And so we have both quantitative, hard numbers that we're trying to reach, and qualitative targets, just kind of judgment calls. And so some of those numbers include things like every block has to have 70 species in it, needs to have 20 hours of effort, an hour of nocturnal effort. The proportion of weak codes to strong codes is set. And then the county coordinators like Emily and Karen in Montgomery County, they take a look at each block and make a judgment call on whether all of the available habitats have been covered in the block, and have observations been made across the whole breeding season, or are we missing a chunk? If all of those have been met, then we can mark the block as completed, and that lets everybody know that we can atlas elsewhere. So Montgomery County is currently in pretty good shape for that. This figure, there's a lot going on here. This is one way of kind of evaluating the breeding code side of things for each block. So down here, you have all the blocks listed for Montgomery County. And here on the left, on the y-axis, you have the number of species that have a breeding code in that particular block. The block target is 70 species. And you can see that about 2/3 of the blocks have reached that target. That's really good. These different shades of purple represent different breeding categories: the possible, the probable, or the confirmed. It's like habitat or nest. And the gold around it represents whether it's reached that proportion. So we're looking for no more than 25% of the weaker codes and at least 25% of the stronger codes. And if they've reached those targets, then Emily and Karen can evaluate them to see, have all the habitats been covered? Have they been visited at all times of year? And the takeaway from this figure is that Montgomery County is in very good shape. In fact, it's in even better shape than what this shows, because some of these blocks that don't look like they're very close are very, very small blocks that, like this Vienna Northeast, if you've been to Great Falls, the entire block is only that little island that you walk across on the bridge to. The rest of this block is in Virginia and doesn't count for us. So this block is actually marked as complete already. Emily and Karen have been very on top of things and have been doing an excellent job with block completion evaluation. So takeaway here is that we're in pretty good shape. I would like to see in this coming year a real focus on finishing up blocks that aren't quite done. And so if you've adopted a block like me, I have 2 blocks in Montgomery County and they're both close, but neither are done. Then this year, really try and wrap them up so that we can focus on counties that are outside of Montgomery County. So then shifting into kind of the conversation about nocturnal effort, which is something that I've emphasized a lot in the past. This figure, which I've I think I've shown you before. I think it's a really interesting one. This is, if you look at blocks that have either 0, 1, 2, or 3 owl species in them, what is the average amount of nocturnal effort that you find in that block? If a block has 0 species of owls in it, on average, it has almost no nocturnal effort. If it has 1 owl, on average, it has about 20 minutes. And if it has 2, on average, it has about an hour. And if it has 3, on average, about an hour and a quarter. You can see where I'm going. Basically, an hour of nocturnal atlasing pays off huge dividends in terms of finding these more cryptic, harder to find species. So this figure right here, this is an image that I showed you last January, when I gave an update. This shows how much effort has been put into nocturnal atlasing across the region. The brighter the blue, the more nocturnal effort that's been put in, but it's cut off at 1 hour because that's the target. So basically, if a square has blue in it, that means that somebody's been out there at night looking for breeding birds. That was last year's. This is the difference that you have made in 1 year. I was completely blown away by this change. I have emphasized nocturnal atlasing a lot because it is, it's more difficult than regular atlasing, and it's not always everyone's first choice. But this, like, everyone deserves a very solid pat on the back for this. This is outstanding. Yes, I'm like, thank you. This is tremendous. This is a huge improvement, and we are really in good shape moving forward on nocturnal effort. Okay, so that was all that I'm going to talk to you about on the effort side of things. The main takeaway for it is really that Montgomery County has put in a lot of work, a lot of effort over the last few years, has done a tremendous job on nocturnal atlasing, especially in the past year. And now, hopefully, we're at a point where we can begin to move into some of the other counties where fewer birders live and help reach those block completion goals there. So what I want to kind of change gears into now is this idea of data interpretation. So when you have an observation, right, that becomes a point in the data set, but it can be interpreted in different ways. And all of that depends on the context of how you want to interpret that observation. So I've got 2 examples here that I'm going to show you. The first is this is a Caspian tern feeding its chick. This fits the breeding code feeding young very well. This is breeding behavior. A parent is feeding its offspring. This chick, it takes terns a while to become proficient at fishing. So they often spend, quite a long time with their parents. And so this chick is still somewhat dependent on its parent. Now, the thing is, Caspian terns don't nest in Maryland, but they will migrate through here from their breeding grounds further north, and you'll still have chicks that are dependent on their parents. And so you can witness exactly this in, the Chesapeake Bay. If you put the breeding code feeding young on this observation, it's not wrong, but it doesn't represent breeding in Maryland. And that is what we are concerned about. We want to document the birds that breed in Maryland. So this observation does not mean breeding in Maryland. So that is an example of how the interpretation, depending on the context, in this example, the context is the location, how that changes the way that you might interpret an observation. The other example here, this is from the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. This is their black-billed cuckoo map from their last atlas. And in Southern Ontario, they use a pretty similar scheme as we do. They call them squares, not blocks, but all the squares are about the same size, and observers go into them, try and find as many birds as they can in Southern Ontario. So you can see here's every block, every square that they found a black-billed cuckoo in. Now, if you go up into Northern Ontario is gigantic, and it has very few roads, and access is very difficult. So they cannot go into every block. Instead, what they do is they overlay it with a grid of 100 by 100 kilometer squares, and then subsample a set of 10 by 10 kilometer squares from within that. And so you get something that looks like this, where we see a smattering of black-billed cuckoo observations in the northwest side and up here on the top end of Lake Superior. But then look down here in the bottom right. And this is kind of my point about interpretation and how context matters. These two maps are both using the same data, and both are correct. Neither are wrong, but both give you a different answer depending on what your context is. The map in the bottom right shows you that, well, black-billed cuckoos are found just about everywhere, south of this line that runs through kind of the bottom half of Northern Ontario. And if you look at the actual places where they were found at a smaller scale, here the picture is a little bit different. There are big gaps and areas where you don't find them. Neither are wrong, but both are just different interpretations of the same observations. This is a larger scale. If you wanted to ask, does black-billed cuckoo nest in Ontario, and then color it in one color if it does, one color if it doesn't, that would also be correct, but it would give you a very different picture. So anyways, that is the idea of how you interpret observations. So I'm going to talk about our data review system, but I'm just going to quickly go over a few definitions so that we're all on the same page with this. An observation is a species from a checklist, just one single species. It's like a row in the data set. You have your breeding status, which we've talked about. There's also observed status, which is a bird that's not breeding, like a Caspian tern, we'll say. The breeding code represents local breeding. For us, local breeding is breeding in that block. I'm also going to introduce the term behavior code. So this is when the code just represents the behavior without that local breeding context. So this would be like the Caspian tern example, right? The behavior code would be that it's feeding its young. From a Maryland perspective, it is not a breeding code. And then the reason is, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. That's just why an observation, why a breeding code was reinterpreted. And that's linked up with the message that you see on a checklist. So for our review process, we assume that the identification of the bird is correct. And that's because eBird reviewers exist and they do their job quite well. It's not a perfect assumption, but it's very good. And then for our review, which is focused on breeding codes, we use the breeding code itself, the date of the observation, and the location. Then the first step of all of this during the review process is to compare the breeding code with the species and to see if there's any sort of a mismatch there. So first we'll check the codes against the expected codes chart. And this chart is just something that has all the species listed and all the breeding codes listed, and whether that code is expected, plausible, or improbable for the species. Kind of going back to what Scott said, if we had distraction display breeding code, that would be an expected code for a killdeer, but it would be an improbable code for a cormorant. So that's kind of how that works. If you have an improbable code on a species, that'll be automatically reinterpreted. Something like a crow that's singing I don't have to go and actually manually look at that. We'll just automatically reinterpret that. The replacement code and the reason for the reinterpretation is all based on that chart and on the date. So that kind of leads into this eBird reason, which, see this little question mark here beside the breeding code? If you click on that in a checklist, that will expand into this text bubble, and that'll give you more information about why the breeding code was reinterpreted. This reason also determines whether the breeding code is kept on as a behavior code or whether it's replaced with a different code. We have two categories. Is it a context dependent difference, like the Caspian tern example, where if you're asking the question at a different scale, then the answer will change? Or is it a likely error? If somebody puts down that a crow is singing, chances are they meant to put in the habitat code and instead hit the singing code. And then this bubble explains in more detail why that reinterpretation was made. The next step on all of this is to look at location. Where was the bird reported from? So every species, it has a set of flags, and they're all based on the eBird reviewers filter. So this is, if you're submitting an eBird checklist and a bird pops up as rare, that's the reviewers filter. We based our filter off of that. They're not identical, but they're very close. And it's based at the county level for almost all birds. The exception is colonial species. Because the breeding of colonial species is so location restricted and centered on that very small area where the colony is, we actually just use a block-based system for them as to whether they're expected or unexpected to be breeding there. And remember that for us, local breeding is at the block level. So then once we have the location figured out for all of the birds and whether they're expected or unexpected there, next we find the highest expected confident breeding code for each species in each block. And that kind of gives us a baseline to evaluate everything else for that species in that block against. If we know that one was breeding there, well, it's more likely that others were breeding there. So the final thing that we look at then is the date. In the past, all that you used were safe dates. Is it inside or outside of safe dates? Instead of just using that, what we've done is we've kind of created these shoulder seasons on the safe dates. And so there's 5 seasons for every species, and they're defined. This would be for Canada goose here. They're defined by the egg dates. And so from January 1st to the first egg date, in this case, that's in March, that'd be your early season. That's very early for any sort of breeding code that is submitted, right? From the first egg date until the safe date, that would be our pre-breeding season. That's when, breeding hasn't really ramped up yet. There's still migrants going through, that sort of thing, but it's certainly still possible. And then of course you have the breeding season where, everything that you see for that species can be assumed to be nesting there. And then it all repeats afterwards, going until the last egg date and then the end of the year. So every observation in the data set then gets assigned the season that they were observed in. So we combine the date and the location together, and we look at it in that kind of that spatiotemporal context. And this is how we decide whether something should be manually reviewed, whether it should be left, just as is, or whether it's an unlikely breeding report. So, for example, if a bird is expected to be somewhere, it's very early in the year, well, then the only thing that is likely is a confirmed breeding code. On the other hand, if it's out of range and it's also early in the year, even if it's a confirmed code, we still want to look at that manually because that seems quite unlikely. Once we have all of that sorted out, we can automatically review a lot of that stuff. It can be reinterpreted based on the season or the location. But all the stuff that's in the middle, right? That is stuff that we want to look at manually. We don't want to just let an automatic series of decisions take over. The problem is that for breeding codes, we need to have something there to review. So we look for whether that observation has comments or pictures associated with it. If it does, then we'll manually review it. If it doesn't, then there's nothing there to actually review. So we'll reinterpret it according to the decision chart that's outlined. For the things that get manually reviewed, we think about the observation in the context of other reported codes in that block, in nearby blocks, how much effort has gone into it, what is the habitat like, is it likely that that bird is nesting in that area? And the general guideline is that the observer gets the benefit of the doubt. The reviewer wasn't there, but the observer was. So observer gets the benefit of the doubt, and then any decision that is made is applied consistently across similar sorts of decisions. Once we're done with that, we review the review. And a lot of this happens visually. So we print out maps like this, and we look at them for things that seem a little odd or out of place or unexpected. We have things like how many codes and which ones were they, proportionally that were reinterpreted. What's the proportion of reasons for that particular species? Where were the observations that weren't accepted, and how many of them were there? Where are the accepted ones? What's the status in those blocks? And we do this for all species. We also look at it kind of in the context of the last atlas. That's what all these green dots on this one are for, where least turns were observed in BBA2. This purple on top of the map, that is the modeled range from eBird's status and trends map. And then we can also see whether the bird is expected or unexpected in each county and where any colonies are known to be. And then finally, we look at, just double check some of these like real extreme observations. This is an example of Baltimore Orioles. Their breeding start date is May 16th, but they have all of these confirmed codes that were accepted, in the 2 weeks leading up to that. So if we look at them, we see, okay, it's mostly nest building codes, and some incubation has started, but it all kind of, it ramps up the closer that you get to the start date. So this all seems pretty legitimate. Might look at a few of them just to kind of get a feeling, but this is, probably very real. What's happening here? Orioles are building their nests 2 weeks before, the recorded egg date. On the other hand, at the end of the season, we're looking at the opposite thing. We've got lots of fledged young, and it kind of tapers off a little bit as you get further away from the safe date at the end. There's this one here carrying nesting material. That one seems fishy, so I'd probably look into that one a little bit closer. But everything else seems like, yeah, that's probably probably good. So that is that's the review system in a snapshot. I'm always happy to talk about it because there's a lot going on. If you have criticisms of it or questions, I'm also very happy to hear about those, because how we review things does influence the final product, and so I want to make sure that we're getting it right. As we move into year 4 of a 5-year project, I really can't believe that I'm saying that already. Feels like I just got here. These are kind of the things that I think that we need to focus on to be like actually very successful for the project as a whole. So I think that we should be atlasing this coming year with this kind of mental framework where we're looking at things as, okay, it's time to complete them. Next year is going to be the last year. Let's put ourselves in a good place for next year to kind of mop up and not be really scrambling next year. This will require intentional atlasing, not so much just passively doing it as you go out birding. And if you're like me and you have adopted blocks, wrap those up. Chances are they're pretty close to being completed already. And with a little bit of extra effort, you'll get those done. And then they're off of Emily and Karen's plate. And you can move on to other spots, which then I would say, please do that. Please adopt a new block, especially in a county that's a little bit further away. Allegheny County, Caroline County, Somerset County, Kent County, all of these are spots that could really use some additional effort in the coming year. If you head to this web address, it will show you a tool that highlights blocks that have already been adopted and blocks that aren't adopted. If you want to adopt a block, you just have to contact the county coordinator and they'll get you set up. We do have some resources to really help with the strategy of your atlasing. You can, of course, just go to the website and you can see, well, how many species have been found in this block and how much effort has been put into it. And that's great. But we have created a set of resources. Currently, they're not updated from last year, but they will be within the next month or so. And they show you where folks have been atlasing in a block, how many species have been found there, if there's a hot spot, how close it is to being completed. It gives you a list of the species that were found there in the past atlas, but haven't been found yet. So things that you can target. These can be pretty helpful. The main downside is that they, as the season goes on, they become less helpful because you've already been updating them and they're static. You can get them at this web address, bit.ly/strategy block maps. And the capitalization on these links does actually matter. So make sure that each word is capitalized. The final thing is to join a blockbusting trip. Baltimore especially has had really good success with this. Blockbusting is essentially taking a group of folks and going out and in a short period of time, really covering a block pretty intensely. This can be quite a social activity and can be a lot of fun. So I'd recommend that you give it a shot if you haven't yet. Finally, I just really want to say thank you to Emily and Karen. They're the county coordinators for Montgomery, and they really have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. And the success that Montgomery County has had is in a large part due to their efforts. They've been working really hard and doing excellent. So thank you specifically to Emily and Karen. If you want to reach out to them, you can, their email is montgomery@mdbirds.org. That's the same for any county. Just put the county name before the @mdbirds and you'll get the coordinator. That's all that I have. thank you so much. You'll get the coordinator. That's all that I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was great. I'm glad things are going well.
Are there any questions for Gabriel? Does anyone have any? Evelyn? Evelyn, you're muted.
Okay. If we, compare this year to this period to the periods that was for the first and even second breeding bird atlases, there's certainly been some change in the climate and I'm wondering if there have been changes, if you're aware of changes in the safe dates, for example.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the reasons why I thought that having those additional like shoulder seasons was a really important thing to do. I don't know that, like, right now I don't know if that's happening, but I would put money that yeah, it is. And it is kind of interesting to look at like that oriole figure that I showed at the end. We see that for quite a few species. And so they're clearly nesting before the safe date starts. It's not just a few early ones, like it actually, ramps up. And so, if you're removing, confirmed codes were generally kept in the past, but probable codes weren't. And if you're removing those, that really impacts things.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
See a couple of
Francisco?
hands up.
Yeah.
There are people with their hands up.
Oh, there are. Let's see.
Francesca?
Oh, there. Andrea?
Yeah, Andrea was ahead of me.
Yeah, hello. I have a question from my partner, Frederick, who is here.
Yes, thank you for a fascinating presentation about an amazing data collection effort. I'm just wondering, in terms of your use of range maps from eBird and kind of expectations and so on, what the risk is in terms of the integrity of the data, in terms of showing things like, okay, you don't expect this range, but maybe the range is shifting because of climate change, or maybe a particular species is nesting earlier than expected. And of course, some of your review techniques would automatically review things and say, well, this is kind of different from what is expected. But of course, that's exactly what you want to be recording, is when things are different from what's expected. So how do you ensure that you really do capture those changes?
Yeah, no, that is an excellent question, and is really one of the things that we were really concerned about doing this, because if you're using your expectations to filter out data, then your data will be biased by what your expectations are. That's okay if your expectations are good, but it's not okay if if they don't line up with reality. So that's one of the reasons why we go through and we review the review. Right, so that's one of the reasons why we plot out where things weren't accepted. If we're seeing oh, okay, there's we've got a pattern that's happening over here, let's look into that, then that's probably a pretty good indication that we have to change things. It's definitely a delicate balance, and we may adjust moving forward, but is certainly something that we're thinking about, especially because, outliers in a data set are like, they're often the indication that something else is going on. When you have, the further an outlier is, the more likely it is that there's some other thing that's happening. So we have to balance this idea of, letting the data show us what is really happening with trying to address human error and our actual interpretations of what, we want to see local breeding in that block.
Thank you.
Francesca?
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really, really interesting. I'm interested in learning more about Charles County. It looks like when I'm looking at the Bitly site, so the stuff that's actually green or the color of the county is not adopted. Is that right?
I think so. I'd have to.
Okay, because there's a lot of Charles County that's unadopted.
I think you're right. I think most blocks in Charles County are not adopted.
Okay, so that's my first question. Second question is, for the nocturnal, what does that look like? I mean, what are you doing? You just get there after dark and walk around for an hour, or get there before light, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, yes, you are correct. It's the shaded areas that are adopted.
Okay.
The green ones are not. And for nocturnal atlasing, there's a couple of articles up on the website that you can look at, which will provide a little more detail, and I can link to them. But yeah, generally speaking, we do recommend for this that you use playback, first of all. That increases the detection rates substantially. This isn't, we're not out birding, we're out sampling these blocks.
Yeah.
So we do recommend that you use some playback. Technically, there's a bit of a disconnect between how nocturnal effort is actually defined and when it's actually effective. If you have been out birding, you know that, you often hear owls right around sunset, sunrise. Technically, that's outside of our nocturnal window. So there's also a little bit of leeway that county coordinators have with evaluating some of that. If the owls have all been found, then they've got some leeway there to mark that block as complete. But generally speaking, if you're going to go out and do actual nocturnal atlasing, then yeah, the idea is to basically head out. I like to mark down places that I'm going to stop at in advance. I look at Google Earth first. I don't usually drive it during the day, but if you can, that's nice. Especially finding spots that have a place to pull over. That can be really tricky. Charles County's tricky for that. A lot of narrow roads. But head out, stop in likely areas of habitat, use the playback for a couple of minutes. Go, screech owl first, barred owl, then great horned. Playback isn't as effective for great horn, but you still can get a response. That's really kind of the basics of it.
So it's sort of like what we used to do in the olden days and called going owling.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody calls it that anymore, but that's essentially. And the last question is, in a nutshell, I'm sure it's on the website and I can go read it, but what is the obligation? If we own some land in Charles County and it's not adopted. So it's sort of like, wow, there's not a house on it or anything, but we visit it pretty regularly. And I just didn't realize it wasn't adopted till right now. So what's the commitment that I would be taking on in a nutshell? I'm sure I can read about it, but if you can just quick summary.
Yeah. So generally, if you adopt a block, the county coordinator is expecting you to meet the block completion criteria. So that 70 species, 20 hours of effort, all of that by the end of the atlas. So that would be by the end of next summer. Now, if you're thinking like, oh, that's like a lot to do by myself or something like
Not
that.
much at all, actually.
You can always talk to the county coordinator and like explain that you're willing to, I guess the really nice thing is for a county coordinator to know that someone is specifically working on that block. It takes a lot of the pressure off, knowing that that's kind of taken care of. So that's the
So, like,
main point.
2 hours a week, every week during the breeding season, that's a good effort.
Yeah, and repeat
Okay.
visits can be some of the most helpful because I didn't talk about it at all tonight, but there's a breeding code that if you hear the same bird, kind of on the same territory singing for a week or more, then that's considered stronger
Right.
evidence than if you just hear it singing once. And the only way to do that, of course, is if you repeat your
Wow.
visits.
Yeah,
So-
no, we have about 100 beehives on this property, so
Oh,
we
wow.
go pretty regularly to take care of them. So,
Oh, cool.
all right, this is exciting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and feel free, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. And feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that.
Right, but I should start with the county coordinator at the address that you had just previously.
Charles@mbirds.org.
Thank you.
Francis, keep your eyes open for bee eaters. We might have a first record for Maryland.
No, what I have for bee eaters are the catbirds in my yard that regularly visit the beehives and chomp
Really?
down.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
Gray
all the
bee
time.
eater.
that's
Yeah.
neat.
And they don't seem to get stung or choke. I think of it as fast food for the busy mom bird,
That's cool. Huh, I didn't know they did that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Janet?
Yes, as someone with a background in data science, I particularly appreciated hearing about how you review codes and reinterpret them, because obviously data quality is a hugely important thing in a database this big. One question, and maybe I missed this, almost your whole description of it, you were using the word we. You and who else does this review?
So me and the steering committee, so there's about 25-ish members on the steering committee, developed the overall system. The actual review is mostly just me. So I'll send the review things around, all those maps and things, and get folks to look at the kind of the more visual side of things. But in terms of the actual, reinterpretation side of things, that's at this point, it's pretty much just me.
Well, you're doing great. Thank you.
Stella?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Gabriel, for such a wonderful, recap of what's been going on and explaining the review process. It's kind of mind-boggling. My question is about the incomplete blocks. Like, what impact do they have, like, at the end of this process? For data collection, your analysis and comparison to, for trend analysis and all that. Like, how does that play into that process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do genuinely think that we won't have any. I think it'll be tough, but I think that we will be in a very good position at the end of the atlas. But there's always things that come up. For example, the Aberdeen Proving Ground. We still have not had any access to that, and I think there's 10 or 12 blocks. So all of my goals about get 100%, have 100% of data with at least, or blocks with at least some data, that hasn't happened at all because of APG. Yeah, so if it is the case that there's some that don't quite meet the minimum threshold, then we'll have to look at that a little bit more closely. But in terms of we'll be for sure we're going to be doing some occupancy modeling, and so it shouldn't be too much. It shouldn't be too bad if there's only a handful of blocks that are like that. We certainly won't have huge swaths the models will be able to withstand some holes as long as they're not too clustered. Yeah.
Keeping fingers crossed, but yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel. That was great.
Thank you, Emily.
Great. I reiterate to Gabriel's plea to finish your blocks this year. Please finish.
Can I ask one more fun question?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what's your dream species that we might yet find in the Breeding Bird Atlas in Maryland?
Honestly, it would be finding the Swainson's warbler. We haven't found any yet, but they do nest here historically, even like as recently as the last atlas. So if somebody finds that, that'll be my I'll be very pleased. But we've had some really cool things, unexpected things already. You may have heard that there were aningas that were found nesting. We had Mississippi kites, Eurasian collared doves. It's been pretty exciting, notwithstanding.
Do tell us the habitat for Swainson's warbler.
Okay, so Swainson's warblers are kind of found in Maryland, at least. They're kind of found in like real swampy areas. There are like specific locations where they have historically been, and pretty much the only places where you can look for them. If you look at the last atlas, or if you look at somewhere on the website, there's the species maps that I've made available. It'll actually show you the block where they were found in the last atlas, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's within the Pocomoke something or other. It's state forest, wildlife management area, something along those lines. But historically they've been pretty deep inside there. I think there's one. I think the one from the last atlas was actually of an individual that was singing pretty close to a bridge. They do like wetter areas. So there is also an area, if I'm remembering right, I think it's in Calvert, or maybe it's Charles County.
I'm looking at I have the book of the second Breeding Bird Atlas on my knees here, and the color used is a very light green, but it's in Calvert, kind of middle of Calvert County, along the shore. And then there's one further east. I can't see exactly where it was.
The other bird that we've very sadly haven't actually had reported for the atlas yet is black rail. We haven't had any breeding records for them yet. So that is, I think, really unfortunate, and hopefully will change. But it definitely, what won't change is that like black rails are having a rough go. So it's unfortunate.
So I guess we should wrap up, let people get on for the rest of their evenings. Thank you all for attending. One reminder, we're looking for a replacement for, or at least a new treasurer for Chris Wright. And for better or worse, I'm the speaker next month. So enjoy your next couple of weeks out birding.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Gabriel.
Thanks, Gabriel, again.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.